January 17, 1943. Oran Harbor, Algeria. The steel hulls groaned against the Mediterranean tide, a chorus of metallic protest that echoed across the water like the keening of wounded beasts. In the pre-dawn darkness, a young Wehrmacht lieutenant named Klaus Zimmermann stood on the captured French fortifications overlooking the harbor, binoculars pressed against his wind-chapped face. Below him, silhouetted against the emerging grey light, a vessel unlike anything he had seen before wallowed toward the docks. Flat-bottomed, grotesquely wide, with a bow that seemed to have been sheared off by some industrial accident. It looked less like a warship than a floating warehouse, a barge that had no business venturing beyond calm rivers, much less crossing an ocean at war. Zimmermann lowered his binoculars and turned to his companion, a grizzled Feldwebel who had survived the beaches of Crete. "Die Amerikaner bauen jetzt Sarge," he muttered, the contempt evident in his voice. "The Americans are building coffins now." The Feldwebel laughed, a sound without humor, and took a long drag from his cigarette. They had heard the intelligence reports. The Allies were constructing a new class of landing vessel, massive, slow, virtually defenseless. The LST, they called it. Landing ship, tank. To German military minds, schooled in the elegant deadliness of the U-boat, the streamlined aggression of the E-boat, these ungainly behemoths represented everything backwards about American industrial philosophy. They were too big to be agile, too slow to evade, too flat to weather rough seas. They were coffins indeed, waiting to be filled. The sound that would haunt Klaus Zimmermann for the rest of his life began then, not a roar or an explosion, but a grinding, inexorable mechanical rumble. The LST's bow doors were opening. What the Germans who mocked those first LSTs could not comprehend, what their entire military doctrine was fundamentally unprepared to counter, was that the Americans had not built ships to fight. They had built ships to deliver, and in that single conceptual shift lay a revolution in warfare that would break the back of Fortress Europe and shatter the Pacific Wall of Imperial Japan. The LST was not a warship. It was an answer to a question that had plagued amphibious commanders since armies first crossed water to make war. How do you move an entire mechanized army, tanks, trucks, artillery, ammunition, fuel, food, directly from the sea onto a hostile shore without the laborious, vulnerable process of offloading into smaller craft? How do you land not just soldiers, but the industrial weight of a nation? The British had learned this lesson in blood at Gallipoli in 1915, where tens of thousands of men died attempting to wade ashore from ships anchored offshore, their supplies scattered across miles of water, their heavy weapons left behind entirely. The Germans, for all their tactical brilliance, had never seriously contemplated a major amphibious assault. Their military culture was built on swift land campaigns, on blitzkrieg doctrine that assumed control of ports and roads. They thought in terms of capture and consolidation. The Americans and their British partners thought in terms of delivery. In November 1941, when American shipyards received the specifications for what would become the LST, naval architects recoiled. The Royal Navy had approached the United States with a desperate request: design a vessel that could cross the Atlantic Ocean under its own power, survive submarine-infested waters, and then drive directly onto a beach to disgorge 30 Sherman tanks or 60 trucks, plus 300 tons of supplies and nearly 200 men. It needed a flat bottom to ground itself on sand, yet remain seaworthy enough for ocean transit. It needed massive cargo doors in the bow, yet structural integrity to withstand combat damage. It needed to be built by the hundreds, yet simple enough for inland shipyards that had never constructed ocean-going vessels. The design that emerged was a compromise that looked like a mistake. At 328 feet long and 50 feet wide, the LST had the proportions of a pregnant whale. Its flat bottom and shallow draft, barely 3 feet forward when unloaded, meant it rolled sickeningly in any sea state above calm. Crews nicknamed them large, slow targets. Sailors transferred to LST duty felt they had been cursed by the Navy guards, condemned to cross hostile oceans in vessels that pitched and yawed like carnival rides, that could barely make 11 knots at full speed, that were armed with nothing more than a handful of anti-aircraft guns. The vessels had no armor. A single torpedo would break one in half. A shore battery could pound one to scrap metal before it ever grounded on the beach. And yet, in the shipyards of Pittsburgh and Evansville, Indiana, cities hundreds of miles from the ocean, the LSTs began to emerge from the assembly lines like industrial miracles. Bridge companies and steel mills, factories that had never built anything that floated, converted their facilities to produce these strange hybrids of ship and bridge. They built them in sections, welded them together, and launched them sideways into rivers that would carry them to the sea. By the end of 1942, the first LSTs were crossing the Atlantic, wallowing through winter storms, their crews gripping anything bolted down as waves broke over the bow, salt water streaming through ventilation shafts, diesel fumes mixing with the smell of vomit and unwashed men. The German coastal defenders, who first saw these vessels approaching through their rangefinders, experienced something between disbelief and professional disdain. Here were targets so large, so slow, that even the most inexperienced artillery crew could not miss. Kriegsmarine officers passed around photographs with mocking commentary. The British, they understood. The Royal Navy had centuries of seafaring excellence. But these American contraptions looked like they had been designed by railroad engineers who had never seen an ocean. Intelligence reports confirmed that the vessels had been built in cities landlocked by 1,000 miles of prairie. The Wehrmacht prepared to receive them with a confidence bordering on contempt. Sicily proved them wrong first. On July 10, 1943, in Operation Husky, 228 Allied LSTs approached the southeastern coast of Sicily in the darkness before dawn, their ungainly hulls rising and falling in the Mediterranean swell. German and Italian coastal batteries opened fire at first light, shells sending up geysers of white water between the advancing vessels. Machine gun positions raked the approaching ships, and the LSTs, ignoring everything, drove straight forward like medieval siege towers advancing across a moat. Their bows struck sand. Their massive front doors dropped with hydraulic precision. Their interior ramps, prepositioned, clanged onto the beach. And then, impossibly, Sherman tanks rolled off those ramps directly onto Sicilian sand, tracks finding purchase, guns already traversing toward inland targets. Behind the tanks came trucks, jeeps, half-tracks, artillery pieces, supply pallets, medical units, everything needed not just to seize a beach but to sustain an advance. The defenders had prepared for landing craft, the small Higgins boats that would disgorge 30 men who would have to wade through surf under fire. They had pre-registered their artillery on the waterline, positioned their machine guns to create killing zones at the tidderline. But the LSTs changed the mathematics entirely. They grounded in 3 feet of water, sometimes less. Their cargo, including 30-ton tanks, rolled off dry, engines running, ready to fight. Within 30 minutes of grounding, an LST could unload its entire cargo and retract. The ships that German observers had mocked as coffins were landing more combat power in a single run than an entire fleet of conventional landing craft could deliver in a day. Oberleutnant Friedrich Weber, stationed at a coastal artillery position near Gela, recorded in his diary that night a passage that would later be recovered from his body after the position was overrun. "We destroyed 3 of the large flat ships today, set them burning with our 88s. We celebrated. But they kept coming. For every one we hit, 5 more reached the beach. We could see the tanks driving off them while we were still reloading. By noon there were more American tanks ashore than we had in the entire sector. By evening we were out of ammunition. The ships were still coming." The recurring sound of those bow doors opening, that mechanical grinding that Klaus Zimmermann had first heard in Oran, became the audio signature of defeat for Axis forces across 2 theaters of war. It was a sound that meant the mathematics of defense had become impossible. Traditional military wisdom held that amphibious assaults were the most vulnerable form of military operation, that defenders enjoyed overwhelming advantages, that 3 attacking soldiers were needed for every defender. The LST inverted that calculus. A single LST landing was equivalent to the sustained delivery capacity of dozens of smaller craft making multiple runs under fire. The defenders' ammunition would run out before the LSTs stopped coming. At Salerno in September 1943, German panzer divisions counterattacked the Allied beachhead with such ferocity that for 2 days the outcome hung in balance. General Mark Clark, commanding the American Fifth Army, prepared contingency plans for evacuation. And then the LSTs saved the landing. Through storms that would have prevented smaller craft from operating, through artillery fire that damaged dozens of vessels, the LSTs continued their shuttle runs, grounding on the beach every 20 minutes, disgorging replacement tanks, ammunition, artillery batteries. A single LST could carry 2,100 tons of cargo. More than 6 Liberty ships could land using conventional methods. The German counter-offensive shattered itself against a constantly replenishing supply line that the defenders simply could not interdict. General Major Rudolf Siakinius, whose 16th Panzer Division spearheaded the Salerno counterattack, was captured 3 months later. In his interrogation, preserved in Allied records, he stated, "We destroyed perhaps 50 of the large landing ships over 4 days. We considered this a victory. But they did not stop. Every morning, more arrived. We could hear them before dawn, that sound of the front opening. We knew what it meant. More tanks, more guns, more ammunition. We were fighting not an army, but a factory that floated. The symbolic power of the LST's bow door, that massive steel maw opening to disgorge an endless stream of American abundance, haunted Axis military thought in those final years. Japanese commanders in the Pacific had their own terminology for the vessels. Democracy ships, though the term was used without admiration, to minds schooled in the warrior code of Bushido, in the belief that fighting spirit could overcome material disadvantage. The LST represented everything alien about American warfare. It was industrial, methodical, wasteful of resources in the pursuit of overwhelming advantage. It delivered not heroes but mechanics, not sacred duty but pragmatic tonnage. And it could not be stopped by courage or clever tactics or desperate sacrifice. At Tarawa in November 1943, the brutal reality of American industrial advantage became undeniable even to the most fervent Japanese defender. The coral reefs that surrounded the island were supposed to be an impregnable barrier. Conventional landing craft would ground on the reef, forcing Marines to wade hundreds of yards through chest-deep water under murderous fire from prepared positions. The Japanese commander, Rear Admiral Keiji Shibasaki, had boasted that 1,000,000 men cannot take Tarawa in 100 years. He had not accounted for the Amtraks, amphibious tractors, that the LSTs carried. The tracked vehicles, launched from LSTs grounded on the reef itself, crawled over the coral and delivered Marines directly to the seawall. The battle was still hellish, casualties horrific, but it was over in 76 hours instead of becoming an impossible stalemate. The LSTs, grounded offshore, served as floating supply depots, hospitals, command posts, repair facilities. They were not ships anymore, but pieces of American infrastructure transplanted to the middle of the Pacific. By June 1944, as the largest amphibious operation in history approached the beaches of Normandy, the LST had evolved from experimental necessity to the keystone of Allied invasion doctrine. Of the nearly 7,000 vessels involved in Operation Overlord, the 236 LSTs were considered so essential that Eisenhower had delayed the invasion by a month when production delays threatened their availability. They were unglamorous, uncomfortable, unsexy vessels, but they were irreplaceable. A single LST could land more cargo in one run than could be brought ashore by crane at a captured port in a full day's operation. With all French Channel ports expected to be destroyed or held by German defenders, the LSTs were not just useful. They were the only means by which the massive supply requirements of the invasion could be sustained. The German defenders on the Atlantic Wall had studied Sicily, studied Salerno, studied the Pacific landings. They knew the LSTs were coming. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, given command of coastal defenses in late 1943, designed his obstacle systems specifically to counter them. Steel hedgehogs positioned at the high water mark. Belgian gates, heavy steel structures embedded in concrete, placed precisely where LSTs would need to ground. Underwater mines attached to posts at low tide depth. Rommel understood that if the LSTs could not reach the beach, the invasion would fail regardless of how many soldiers landed from smaller craft. The supplies, the tanks, the artillery, the fuel, everything that sustained a modern army, came from the LSTs. On the morning of June 6, 1944, as the first LSTs approached Omaha Beach through seas rough enough that smaller craft were swamping, German artillery observers finally had the targets they had prepared for. Shore batteries opened fire at ranges where they could not miss. 523 took a direct hit while still 200 yards from shore, broke in half, and sank in under 5 minutes. 376 grounded on a sandbar, unable to reach the beach, its cargo useless. 499 struck a mine, its bow doors blown inward, flooding the cargo deck, drowning men and vehicles in the dark interior. And 73 other LSTs at Omaha Beach alone drove past the burning wrecks, through the shell impacts, through the machine gun fire, and put their bows on the sand. Their doors opened. Their ramps dropped. And despite the chaos, despite the carnage, despite the momentary near failure of Omaha Beach, the supplies began flowing. By nightfall, when the beachhead was still desperately shallow, still threatened by counterattack, 2,400 tons of supplies had been landed at Omaha alone, the vast majority delivered by Estes. At Utah Beach, where resistance was lighter, Estes landed over 4,000 tons. Gold, Juneau, and Sword Beaches, the British and Canadian sectors, saw similar numbers. In 24 hours, the equivalent of an entire month's supply for a pre-mechanized army had been put ashore. The sound that had haunted Klaus Zimmermann in Oran now echoed across Normandy, that grinding mechanical rumble of bow doors opening, of steel ramps clanging onto sand, multiplied by hundreds of repetitions. German commanders listening to field reports heard that sound described again and again. The flat ships are landing. More material ships arriving. We cannot stop the landings. By June 8, with the beachhead consolidated, LSTs were arriving in shuttle runs every hour, grounding on the beach, unloading, retracting, returning to England for more cargo. They operated in daylight, indifferent to air attack because Allied air superiority was complete. They operated through storms that kept conventional cargo ships at anchor. They operated while under artillery fire, their crews closing watertight doors and continuing to unload while shells burst around them. Generaloberst Friedrich Dollmann, commanding 7th Army in Normandy, committed suicide on June 28, 1944. His final report to Field Marshal Rommel, discovered among his papers, contained a passage that revealed the psychological weight of what the defenders faced. We cannot destroy them faster than they arrive. Today we recorded 68 of the large landing vessels at Omaha and Utah alone. We have artillery in position to fire on them. We sink perhaps 3 or 4 each day, but the others complete their landing and depart. Tomorrow 68 more will come. We are trying to empty the ocean with buckets. In the Pacific, the LST enabled a form of warfare that Japanese strategic planning had assumed impossible. Japan's defensive strategy relied on the vast distances of the Pacific Ocean and the limited range of amphibious capability. Islands like Saipan, Iwo Jima, Okinawa were fortified as unsinkable battleships, with the understanding that the logistical complexity of assaulting across thousands of miles of ocean would make American casualties unsustainable. The LST shattered that assumption. With 4,000-mile range and the ability to operate from forward bases established by previous LST landings, the vessels became self-sustaining supply chains. They carried not just invasion cargo but the infrastructure of forward bases, fuel bladders, ammunition dumps, field hospitals, water purification units, construction equipment, prefabricated housing. At Iwo Jima in February 1945, the volcanic sand proved nearly impassable for wheeled vehicles. The battle threatened to become a nightmare of men struggling to move supplies inland while under fire from Mount Suribachi and the entrenched positions throughout the island. The LSTs, grounded on the black sand beaches, became unloading platforms. Their tank decks were converted to sorting areas. Their medical facilities treated casualties that were carried directly onto the ships from the beach. Their galleys fed not just their own crews but hundreds of Marines. They were not ships participating in a battle, but pieces of American industrial civilization transplanted to the shoreline of hell. Lieutenant Haru Kobayashi, a Japanese artillery observer who survived the battle in hiding and was captured weeks later, provided testimony that is preserved in the U.S. Marine Corps archives. We knew we could not defeat the landing, but we believed we could make it so costly that the Americans would negotiate. Every night I watched the beach from my position in the caves. The ships never stopped coming. We fired on them until we had no ammunition. They kept coming. We realized then that we were not fighting an army. We were fighting a country that had learned how to move itself across oceans. The recurring symbol through all these invasions, present in hundreds of photographs and miles of film footage, is cargo, stacked higher than human height, waiting on docks, loaded on ships, unloaded onto beaches, distributed inland. Crates of ammunition, drums of fuel, pallets of rations, boxes of medical supplies, replacement engines, spare tank tracks, artillery shells, everything required to keep a mechanized army fighting, duplicated and multiplied by American industrial capacity until the sheer quantity of material became a weapon more decisive than any tactics. The LST was the delivery mechanism for that weapon. Each bow door opening was another injection of American abundance directly into the combat zone. German and Japanese military cultures, despite their profound differences, shared a common contempt for this style of warfare. They considered it unglamorous, lacking in warrior spirit, the approach of shopkeepers rather than soldiers. But that contempt could not alter the mathematics. An American infantry division consumed 650 tons of supplies per day. A German division consumed 350 tons. The American division could maintain that consumption because LSTs could deliver it regardless of whether ports were available. The German division would starve once rail lines were cut. The Japanese division would starve faster because Japan lacked LSTs entirely, unable to resupply their island garrisons once the American submarine campaign interdicted their shipping. By August 1945, when LSTs landed occupation forces in Japan itself, the symbolic victory was complete. The vessels that had been mocked as floating coffins had carried Allied armies across every defended shoreline in Europe and the Pacific. Of the 1,051 LSTs built during the war, 117 were lost to enemy action or weather, a casualty rate of 11% across 4 years of continuous operation in the most dangerous military activity possible. By contrast, the German Navy's U-boat force suffered a casualty rate of 75%. The Japanese destroyer force that attempted to interdict American amphibious operations was effectively annihilated. The LST, the ugly duckling of naval architecture, had proven nearly indestructible not through armor or speed, but through redundancy and numbers, and the industrial capacity to replace losses faster than they occurred. The recurring sound, that grinding mechanical rumble, echoed in the silence after the war. Klaus Zimmermann, the young lieutenant who had mocked the first LST in Oran Harbor, survived the war. He was captured at Falaise in August 1944, held in a POW camp in Kansas, and repatriated to Germany in 1947. Before he died in 1983, he gave an interview to a German documentary filmmaker examining why the Wehrmacht had lost the war. The interview is preserved in the Bundesarchiv. When asked what moment in the war had first made him believe Germany would lose, he did not mention Stalingrad or the fall of Berlin. He described standing on a clifftop in Normandy in June 1944, watching LSTs approach through the morning haze. The doors opened, he said, his voice still carrying the echo of that shock across 4 decades, and tanks drove out, directly onto the beach, not into small boats, not to be assembled later. They drove out ready to fight. I counted 20 ships doing this at once. I realized then that we were fighting people who had found a way to drive roads across the ocean. You cannot defeat that. You can only wait to surrender. The LST was not retired after World War II. The basic design proved so successful that variations remained in service through Korea, Vietnam, and into the 21st century. The fundamental innovation, the ability to deliver heavy cargo directly from ship to shore, remained militarily relevant long after the ships themselves had rusted into obsolescence. But the true legacy of the LST is not measured in hulls and tonnage, but in the conceptual revolution it represented. Warfare is ultimately about logistics. The ability to move men and material to where they are needed, in sufficient quantity, with reliable timing, determines victory more surely than tactics or courage or superior weapons. The LST was the mechanical embodiment of that truth, ugly and unglamorous and utterly indispensable. Somewhere in the deep waters off Normandy, in the darkness where sunlight fades to permanent night, the wreck of S-523 still rests. Its bow doors are open, frozen in the moment of its destruction, still facing toward the beach it never reached. Around it lie the rusted hulks of tanks and trucks and jeeps, the scattered cargo it was carrying when the shell struck. In that eternal darkness, corroded by decades of salt water, those doors remain a monument to a simple idea that won a war. That abundance, consistently delivered, defeats scarcity and skill and desperate courage. That a nation capable of building 1,000 ships to carry supplies will defeat a nation with 1,000 reasons why supplies cannot be delivered. That the grinding mechanical sound of steel doors opening onto a hostile beach is the sound of democracy itself. Inelegant, overwhelming, inexorable, indifferent to the aesthetic judgments of those who believe warfare should be glorious rather than effective. The LSTs were not glorious. They were simply unstoppable. And in the calculus of total war, That was the only measurement that mattered.